We were very happy to welcome Sumi Madhok, Professor for Political Theory and Gender Studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Yes, so we're happy to have her here. Her areas of research are at the intersection of feminist political theory, coloniality, transnational activism, social movements, human rights, citizenship, developmentalism, and ethnography. So she covers a wide range of theoretical and methodological areas. She's an anti-colonial, transnational, and interdisciplinary scholar. And at the moment, we are lucky that she is here as a Mercator Fellow of the DFG-funded project Theorizing Postdevelopment. She has just recently published her book Vernacular Rights Cultures, which we see on the screen already. The Politics of Origin, Human Rights, and Gendered Struggles for Justice, which has won actually the Susan Strange Best Book Prize by the British International Studies Association and the Sussex International Theory Prize of 2022. But not only is she an excellent scholar who also published further books on rethinking agency, developmentalism, gender, and she also published an edited volume on gender agency and coercion with Kalpana Wilson and Phillips together. She's also an excellent teacher, apparently. So although I haven't been to her seminars, I have to admit, but she's won numerous prizes for excellence in teaching. So this is, I think, especially sympathetic as teaching somehow seen as the less important duty of those in academia. So her talk is entitled Global Epistemic Justice, Post-Development, and Knowledge Production in the Social Sciences. And for the next 40-45 minutes, Sumi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aaron. That was so kind and generous. And thank you so much for inviting me here to Kassel, and thank you so much to Neil and to Carlos and to B today for making sure that the logistics are up and running. So what I'm going to do is I've got 40, 41, 42 minutes, and when I have about 5, just tell me about 5 and I'll just start wrapping up. Is that okay? Because just so that I don't lose track of time too much. Okay, so I've got a set of PowerPoints, and my apologies that this is in English and not translated. And so for people who are watching and hearing it in different languages, I apologize for that, because in my work I stress the importance of different knowledges produced in different languages, and the importance of linguistic competencies, and to take that quite seriously, and you'll see what I'm talking about as I go along. That might become apparent. So I thought that for today, I'd because I was asked to give a public lecture on a project called Theorizing Post-Development, that I should actually talk about my own very productive and generative engagements with the thinking on post-development, and particularly with the work of activists who are following, and also, of course, I've been following our science work and so on. But today I'm going to talk a bit about, as I said, my own thinking around the question of global epistemic justice in relation to some of the interventions made by post-development scholars. Okay, so I first started thinking about, as I said, about post-development while tracking rights struggles by subaltern groups in what I call most of the world. You'll see that I'm very deeply worried and cautious about binarisms within social science knowledge production, so I avoid any kind of binarism as much as I can. So in terms of West, non-West, and so on. And I prefer really to use most of the world rather than, again, sort of instituting and reproducing binarisms while also seeking to critique them, right? So we have to be quite careful in terms of our own intellectual sort of work and practices. And so as I was tracking the subaltern struggles of rights and justice across whole swathes of South Asia, and by that time, when I came to seriously think about questions raised by post-development scholars, I've already been about a decade into tracking some of those struggles. And it was sort of, I was struck by a whole range of arguments that were being used by all within post-development thinking, but particularly the one that particularly the one by Arturo Escobar in a series of essays starting from 1992, but then ranging right up to 2007, in which he was talking about how to think about post-development as an transcendent imaginary, as an imaginary that enables one to visualize a time after development. And so there was this great amount, if you like, of emphasis in his work in asking us to, think about this, how we might think about this time after post-development. Now, at that point, I was very circumspect. I'm just going to sort out this, the PowerPoint one. Can I have it on full screen so that it's not, otherwise I can't have the animations.
Give me 1 second.
Thank you.
Ja, Anzeige B oder where?
Just the full screen.
Vollbildmodus.
Yeah, perfect. That's great.
Okay.
Okay, so the problem as I saw it was that I became hugely, the more I read about it, I became a little bit circumspect about this post-development as a transcendent imaginary, as asking us to visualize a time after development. And it seemed to me that the problem was that this imaginary, or this aspect to visualize a time after development, was not taking into account the real serious question of counterconduct. Now, if you think about Escobar's own work, right, and his own interventions, particularly in encountering development and so on, whereby development is seen as a form of discourse, right? So he's very Foucauldian at that point. He's talking about development as a form of discourse and so on, but also as a form of, and moving on, if development is a form of discourse, then it is also a form of governmentalized power, right? So as a form of governmentality. And so, but if development is a form of governmentality, so if you think about what is the definition of governmentality that Foucault gives, is the conduct of conduct, right? It's the production. So it's a very productive, so he's talking about the ways in which modern power in the 20th century comes up as something which is not compressive, not top-down, capillary, and also productive. So it is productive movements, right? It's not repressive, and so on. And of course, then if all of that is happening, right, that question of counterconduct is something that Foucault then talks about in his much later work, when there is a big critique of some of that work that he's talking about, whereby, which were asking him to give an account of resistance points, right? So if everything is, if everything is located within context of power, then how do people institute acts of resistance against that very power that constitutes them, right? Now, this is not only a question that is directed at Foucault, it's directed to a whole range of other theorists, but at any point, this becomes a big question that's asked of Foucault's work as called critique. And in order to think about that, he puts forward this idea of counterconduct. And he puts that idea of counterconduct, which is a resistant concept, right? He talks about counterconduct as a specifically resistant concept in the Collège de France lectures, Security, Territory, and Population. And you find that piece on counterconduct in that particular intervention that he makes. And so for Foucault, but he's very careful that for him counterconduct is not an outright rejection of government in general, or governmental power, but rather it institutes a perpetual questioning of that power, right? And so in the sense that it it institutes a perpetual questioning of that power, but it's also a preoccupation. And so in that questioning of power, it institutes a preoccupation about the way to govern and search for the ways to govern, and also about how not to be. So the counter-conduct is how not to be governed like that, or in the name of those principles, with such an objective in mind and by means of such procedures, right? So not like that, not for that, not by them, rather than sort of overthrowing of that whole, that whole structure and system of government. So in that sense, it's, he is asking, by making that intervention, he's sort of saying, well, how do we think about waves of resistance whereby it's not about overthrowing an outright revolution, but really to conduct and be conducted differently? Right, so if you remember when I started saying that the definition that Foucault offers of governmentality is the conduct of conduct, right? And this is where, and in order to institute resistance within this thinking, he institutes this concept of counterconduct in order to sort of say, how do we think about not to be conducted in this particular way? How can we conduct ourselves differently? And so that made me think about the fact that, of course, if you are thinking about that governmentalized power produces its own perpetual questioning of powers, right? And so in that way, it makes it quite hard, and therefore counterconduct, it makes it quite hard to visualize a time after development. Why? Because if development is a form of governmentalized power, it produces its own forms of counterconduct, which I call counterdevelopment. Right? And that counter-development then produces this perpetual questioning of development, right? This perpetual questioning of critiques of development within the frame of development, all of the time. Think about it, it's a whole factory by itself, a whole cottage industry by itself. And so this questioning of development, or perpetual questioning of development, in line with Foucault's idea of counterconduct, sets off counter-development, which I have called counter-development, while producing and engaging with critiques of development, thereby producing its own object of critique, right? So you produce your own object of critique, you reproduce it all the time via critique. And so we're also, then what I was sort of saying to you right at the beginning, we have to be so careful about our intellectual practices. So even though you are critiquing it all the time, you're reproducing the object of critique by not shifting the site of that of critique itself. And so counter-development then, in line with Foucault's idea of counterconduct, marks not a sharp break with development, but rather configures development as a site of continual contestation over how to improve, seek, expand, among other values, rights and justice, or think about right to development. And the kind of interventions that have been kind of, instituted in the name of right to development. And this counter-developmentalism emerges through modes of political subjectivation. That development and its accompanying ideas, in particular human rights. You cannot think about development now without the question of rights. Right? And that has become the kind of standard way in which development lobby kind of produces itself. And so therefore, but all of this, my point was, being at that point, was that it makes it possible to imagine different forms of sociality and challenge existing ways of development, while also making it impossible to imagine a time outside of development, right? Because you are instituting and reproducing the object of critique, although this time via critique, via counterconduct. At any rate, but the more I kept up with tracking these struggles of rights and justice, so this is, at one time, my immersion in post-development, and trying to think about the kinds of challenges and intellectual difficulties that some of what was being asked was actually producing on the ground. And as I kept up with this tracking of language, of these struggles, which were really that tracking was to ethnographically document languages of claim making, and so therefore my insistence on language and my apology earlier. And the forms of rights politics they deployed, it also became evidently clear to me that something else was going on. right? So yes, there was this production of counter-developmentalism and so on, but there was also something else going on. The important thing to remember here is that developmentalism and dispossession constitute important sites of subaltern rights talk, particularly in South Asia and in most of the world, right? And so they're also the grounds on which subaltern groups resist and challenge the irresistible power and authority and authoritarianism of the state. And so even while this developmentalism and rights talk produces its own forms of governmentalized power, including counter-development or counterconduct, what becomes impossible as one starts looking at these rights struggles much more carefully is that the subaltern groups stage their struggles, forms of counter-development and rights politics through very particular and specific imaginaries and vocabularies of world-making. And a very particular language of conceptual of rights and entitlements, which run counter to the kind of mainstream liberal democratic languages. And so, I'm going to try this again. Right, yes. And so trying to just to kind of underscore that point that there is something else going on, right? And of course, so while I'm still thinking about counter-development, and at some point I find a way out of it, like I said, out of trying to think about that conundrum that poses. Escobar released, writes 2 other books in the meantime, and Designs for the Pluriverse, and of course the Pluriverse, which is published in 2020. And in some ways, he then he writes some of the things that make it quite a productive generative debate about how to think beyond that conundrum of counter-developmentalism, right? And for example, in the Pluriverse, he writes that the ontological occupations of territories and worlds take place in the name of development, right? So he is also kind of underscoring the fact that that struggle is taking place on that terrain of development. And for him, the Pluriverse, in the Pluriverse, he sets out to actually reflect on the tools and concepts of social movements to make another world possible through those struggles against, against the kind of economy, capitalism, but also development, right? The kinds of the ordering of the world through capitalism and development. And so, I don't know how many of you read the Pluriverse, but I would recommend it. I think it's a very, very super thoughtful and super sophisticated book. But just to say that the notion of pluriverse, just to give you a very quick introduction, the notion of pluriverse, and he's talked about it, as I said, in the earlier work on the designs of the pluriverse of 2018, and a whole range of people associated with post-development or the ontological turn, particularly in anthropology, have talked about, pluriverse in different ways. So he's certainly not among the only person. There are a range of people, including Marisol de la Cadena, and various others. And the notion of pluriverse for him has 2 main sources. There are the theoretical critiques of dualism and the so-called post-dualist trends stemming from the ontological turn in social theory, but also the perseverance of non-dualist philosophies, more often known as cosmovisions and cosmologies, that reflect what he calls a deeply relational understanding of life, such as Ubuntu, Pachamama, and also some of the Buddhist philosophies. And so what he's doing with the pluriverse, and of course he's also looking at the, as I said, the concepts and tools and knowledge production by social groups involved in struggles on the ground, social movements involved in struggles on the ground, particularly in Colombia, right? So he's looking at very particular groups in Colombia and Southwest Colombia involved in struggles on the ground. And the he has a range of interventions that he talks about, particularly sort of an ontological politics as opposed to an epistemological one. He kind of goes with the ontological turn. He talks about these social mobilizations involved in in politics, which are sort of de-link themselves from statist politics, right? From engagement stage, and so on and so forth. Makes it easier. And what he wants to do is then he wants to look at these autonomous place-based movements, right? Which he says are involved in thinking about a multiplicity of ways of world, right? So, as I said, his sources are social movements or the concepts and tools produced by social movements, epistemologies of the South, which he borrows from Santos. You know, and the political and political ontology. So all of them, he says, are crucial sources for moving beyond development. So that concern with development stays in this work, but you know, he's kind of moving beyond thinking about visualizing, just asking to visualize time after development, but really putting forward certain kinds of intellectual resources which would enable one to do that. And I think that's what changes in this particular book. But the intervention is also much broader. It's no longer development, right? It's thinking about shifting the episteme of social sciences completely. And so that's him. And what kind of struck me that you know, one of the things that struck me about Escobar's interventions in the pluriverse is his insistence on epistemic authority of knowledges produced by social movements. And I want to come back to this point right at the end, because I think this is a key question that we're faced with at this point. And as someone who has invested so much energy arguing for an alternative episteme knowledge production of by social movements, you know, Escobar, right? He's talking about that. Paradoxically, he turns away from epistemology, which he associates with modern Cartesian dualism and towards an ontological thinking, deriving from the ontological term, as I was saying earlier, in humanities and social sciences. And he and that I find quite paradoxical, and I think that there has been the turn to or the turn to ontology, or the ontological turn in the social sciences, you know, is not without its critics, right? It's not without big problems, because it's my own thinking around this is that, you know, on the one hand, one is asking for epistemic authority, right, and epistemic justice, and at the same time, you cannot just kind of take that ground of your feet and say, actually, we're not going to intervene, we're not going to link up with this. You know, with all of these, with the kinds of intellectual resources that count as knowledge, because we're just going to simply do it. We're going to talk, you know, about another set of intellectual resources, and I think something is lost in that. And I want to come to that in a bit. So what was really clear, you know, as I was reading, and I've been reading, as I've been, you know, engaging with Escobar's work for now almost, you know, 7-8 years, you know, coming to a decade. And what was clear was that at face value, there were differences, stark differences between what I was kind of tracking and what he was talking about. So the struggles that and I will come to those struggles, talking about the struggles that I was tracking on the ground, but of course there were ecological struggles, but not predominant. Right? There were also a whole range of subaltern groups, not all of them indigenous, not all of them tracking, not all of them talking about ecological struggles. And Escobar's own sort of intellectual resources for tapping into the conceptual tools and theories that are produced by social movements was looking at published manifestos of these groups. Right? So he looked at published manifestos, which were put forward at different points of time. Right, so you know, not very often, but different points of time, as and when there were these big conventions happening. And so he has been looking at it. But what are the groups that I've been tracking are sort of, you know, politically literate groups, but they're not formally literate. Most subaltern groups are not formally literate in that kind of way in which that they, I mean, it's that classic problem of can the subaltern speak, right? It's not the can the subaltern speak, but can the hegemonic leader hear, right? So it's actually a different problem. It's not whether they can speak, but whether you can hear. because of the fact that they are using very different kinds of ways of thinking, epistemologies, and so on. So there were no published. So the groups that I'm tracking are, I'm tracking their vernaculars, I'm tracking their, documenting, ethnographically documenting this languages of rights and claim making, but they don't have these published manifestos that I can just go and sort of say, look, they've used these tools and so on. And then they were also intensely conflictual. These struggles are intensely conflictual, and they're intensely conflictual for a range of reasons. They are they are risk saturated, they're injurious, and so on, but not least because of the kinds of violence by the state that these struggles attract, right? So this is not a very, when you read the pluribus, and this has been a problem with us Escobar's work for a while, which is that you don't get a sense of somebody of a scholar so interested in questions of power and discourse, you don't find much by way of an account of how those struggles and the power within those movements and struggles and so on. So, right? Very little account of conflict. So pluriverse emerges as a very niche concept, right? And with very little accounting for power within social movements. Like I said, I'll come back to this question because this is a really key problematic for thinking about how to think about knowledge production within social movements. And these movements that I was tracking were not beyond the state, as in that they had not delinked themselves from the state. They were actually making direct claims at the state for various, particularly welfare measures, right? And for an expansion of rights repertoires and rights claim making. So these were not, these were not little hermetically sealed autonomous groups operating somewhere with their own economies and with their own lives and so on. These are actually on a very confrontational path with the state, demanding very particular rights and claims. And so in that moment, there was very little epistemic delinking of the kind of sort that Walter Mignolo talks about, right? In terms of that very clear epistemic delinking with epistemologies of the state and so on, but also implicit and sometimes, explicit in Escobar's work, primarily because, of course, they are using that language of claim making and rights and so on. But there's a complex intertwining and also an epistemic refusal, together with alternative political imaginaries for the justification and recasting of the rights, for both the politics of rights and the politics of justice. So that's something else that I said is going on. It's not your standard rights claiming, something else is going on, right? So there is, yes, there is that. You've got the claim making, you've got the state as one of the key actors in this. You've got a language, a very clear language of claim making, and which intersects with some parts of rights and human rights, but it's not the same. There's something else going on. And so here's what I've been doing, in case you've been wondering what kind of tracking you've been doing. Right. So I've been tracking rights politics. That one on top actually says rights politics in most of the world. I've been looking at subaltern for nearly 2 decades now. I've been looking at subaltern mobilizations for rights and justice, both in India and in Pakistan. And in India, my fieldwork has now moved to 5 districts of Rajasthan, which is the northwestern desert state. And it's been looking at and recording narratives by development workers, political workers, participants in various citizen mobilizations under the umbrella of right to food, which is quite distinct from the food sovereignty movements in Via Argentina, but they are linked because they have some lineages, but they are not the same. So under the right to food movement, which as well as rights, as I said, of activism of various primary development workers and so on. The Right to Food movement is an umbrella organization. It includes a number of citizenship struggles, including right to information, which is right to public information, right, official information by the state. Right to employment, forest rights, Dalit rights, amongst other things. So you can already sort of see that obviously the claimant, claim this is not occurring in some kind of a different site altogether. And in Pakistan, I've been tracking the Anjum al-Mazareen, which is the Tenants Association of the Punjab, which has been demanding restoration of land rights by sharecropping to sharecropping peasants over land that has been taken over by the military of Pakistan. It's emerged the most important, significant working class movement against the military of Pakistan, in post-colonial Pakistan. So as you can see, that all of these groups are actually involved in very what would be seen as pretty risky and injurious kinds of struggles, right? Conflict-driven, both in relation to the state, right? Because of the fact that the state has irresistible power, right, of various kinds, but also in relation to various other kinds of rights that get demanded in their place. So I can't quite read what's on top. So there must be it must say, oh dear, now I've lost this. Let me try this. Yeah, I think it should say, but all of this, what was going on, particularly that something else that I said was going on, led me to think that there is a need for an intervention for thinking about the questions of recasting a whole range of questions within social theory that these groups have brought up, particularly in relation to justice, how we theorize justice, but also how we theorize rights and human rights. And that needs to be a much more concerted intervention into thinking about global epistemic justice rather than actually taking, making that intervention directly into the social sciences by thinking about global epistemic justice. And so what are here are some of the things that I think are key to thinking about global epistemic justice, right? One is to kind of foreground racialized colonial unknowing, right? The fact that you can be this absolute, like I said, critique and produce these most fabulous critiques, and you can be this very radical scholar producing critique upon critique, but that at no point, or say for critique of human rights, right? So, but at no point there is any compulsion or any requirement that you know anything about the rights and organizations in relation to the world about producing a critique. So in that moment, you're producing critique upon critique, but you're also reproducing the object of that critique, right? Which is the West. So all of the time, that critique is produced without having any kind of any kind of insistence by anyone that you need to sort of look at maybe what's happening on the globe. So whenever people tell me, oh, under neoliberalism, we're all depoliticized and so on, so I just sort of say, where are you looking? I want to know, right? What is the politics of location going on? Tell me, from where are you kind of theorizing? And that's really important. So racialized colonial unknowing, which has been instituted, which is an implicit institution in the social sciences. You just don't need to know anything. You have, whole courses on political theory, philosophy, and so on and so forth. And you need to know nothing, absolutely nothing about what's happening in the rest of the world. And then when you do come to know about the rest of the world, right? The rest of the world or the global south is presented as a case study. Right, that's how it then gets seen. So one of the interventions that I absolutely have is to please do not case studify the global south, right? So it appears as the case study of the global, right? Appears as the local, right? So the local global binary, or it appears as a site of simplistic and unidirectional translation, whereby that simplistic and unidirectional translation occurs from a particular site in the global north and it goes into the global south, where all of those ideas are then translated into local languages, right, without actually having anything to say back. Right? So we don't need, again, to know anything about the global south. We can make do with this unidirectional and simplistic translation, right, whereby all the concepts that we have, we can just there's this understanding that somehow there is this kind of unidirectional and simplistic translation. And we need to, and following from that, address the lack of conceptual diversity. Because, you know, so in that sense, you've got this range of concepts, and that somehow they will just get. So think about how the number of courses that you have, say, in a discipline that I know, political science, right, or international relations, on democratization of Africa, or democratizing Africa, or, you know, there are titles like that, right? So in that moment about how particular concepts are then seen to go, you know, and that there's only a range of concepts. And so therefore the intervention really is, people are talking about increasingly in the last 5, 7, 10 years, so about theorizing from the global south. My intervention really is to actually, we don't need so many theories, we need concepts from the global south. Why? Because concepts are the sort of building blocks of theory, right? We theorize on the basis of concepts we have. So producing concepts from the global south and also refusing the implicit methodological nationalism. So every time one does, sometimes when one does think about the global south, immediately go into methodological nationalism, right? So thinking in terms of nation states and so on and so forth, and not sort of moving beyond any of that kind of framing. Okay, so so the proposal then in relation to global epistemic justice, remember I'm looking at rights and I'm looking at justice, is really to retool thinking on human rights and justice in a way that enables rights politics in most of the world to appear as an epistemic presence. I'll come to it in a bit. So it enables it to appear as an epistemic presence and to give an epistemic accounting of this rights politics in most of the world. So, how much time do I have? Just trying to see if we do want to.
12 minutes altogether.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's just let me just sort of say that in terms of thinking about epistemic presence, I mean that that they have their own languages, political imaginaries, justifications, and that they're not simply translated, right? So it's moving away from that. And to give an epistemic accounting, then you need to think about, in terms of the kinds of, as I said, languages that are produced, but also the kinds of subjects that come into being as a result of those rights politics. And it turns out that, and so in order to make this epistemic presence of these groups and mobilizations that I've been tracking for, like, as I said, a decade or so, I had to come up with a theoretical framework for thinking about them, because if I didn't, then that would mean that I would fall into the trap of reproducing the epistemic authority of the global human rights discourse, right? Which has very particular kinds of ways of thinking about human rights, which kinds of rights get seen as rights, which kind of people get seen as rights subjects, which, and so on and so forth, right? And also the problems of global human rights discourse, which is kind of, but I'm happy to talk about them at, later in Q&A, which is really the problems of minimalism, moralism, and the refusal to link with any projects of justice, right? And so, whereas these groups that we're talking about, we're really talking about an alignment of the politics of rights with the politics of justice. And so there was that. So I had to think about this whole framework of thinking about human rights politics in most of the world, which is vernacular rights cultures, which is why that is there's a photograph of the book that appears, but also a methodology. So you've got a framework, but how are you going to study these subaltern mobilizations of rights politics in most of the world? You need to be, you need to think quite carefully about the methodologies that are involved, how to study them. So you can think about them, but how are you going to study them? And so for that, I also have to come up with thinking about a methodological device, which I won't talk about today because that requires a whole 45 minutes lecture for another time, which is feminist historical ontology. Okay, so now, at this point, you might ask me, okay, so, how do you study these, how do you make sure that there's epistemic accounting and epistemic authority, and how does one do that? Well, I wanted to actually give you a much more close-up of that photograph, but I just couldn't manage only this much. But if you look at the cover of the book, you'll see that, that there's the word hak. Some of you might read language, right? So the word hak actually appears in 8 different languages on the cover of the book. And so the languages are Hebrew, Hindi, Manipuri, Persian, Swahili, Turkish, Urdu, and Arabic, right? And the word hak appears in all of these languages as the principal word for a right across Middle East, North Africa, Iran, Turkey, South Asia, most of East Africa. And so in that moment, it translates, and these are the languages that I have tracked, right? But there must be others, and I don't know. But this doesn't include the indigenous languages, which also use this word, particularly in this part of the world. And so, it's there are very particular reasons how the word actually comes into South Asia, because of course Persian was the state language before the arrival of the colonial British state in South Asia, right? And so on and so you find that the word sort of has kind of stayed on, and you find has a very particular resonance and is used as as I said, it is used as a key word to make rights claims within subaltern groups in both northwest India and in North Pakistan. So obviously the word hak is very cosmopolitan, right? You can see it's right across 2 continents, 8 different languages, and so on. And so the word hak actually provides my cue for thinking about vernacular rights functions, right? So the vernacular is very particular intervention. And so I've been tracking, as I was sort of saying to you earlier, I've been tracking the deployment of hak, right? That's what I've been doing. So I've been tracking and therefore that insistence on conceptual vocabularies, concepts, conceptual languages, through the deserts of Rajasthan in northwest India, where different subaltern groups, as I was sort of saying earlier to you, have been mobilizing to demand rights to food, information, and so on, and where Adivasi groups, which are indigenous groups, demanding rights to sacred and ancestral forests, streams, rivers, and lands. The word hak, of course, does not recognize national borders and formations, right? And that is why that critique of methodological nationalism, whenever one talks about the global south, one immediately kind of slips into that. Let's just talk about the nation state, but actually, if you are doing this kind of tracking, you realize that this sort of politics and these conceptual languages don't recognize the nation state and national borders. In fact, it kind of undermines them. And so I've been tracking deployment of hak within subaltern mobilizations, both in India and Pakistan, from Rajasthan's eastern regions, which are mostly rocky and forested and sand-filled terrains, to the Aravalli Hills in its south, where the dry tropical forests burst into thick, lush undergrowth in the monsoons. And I've traveled with it further, so I've tracked the word further northwest into the subcontinent, as I was saying to you earlier, where for the last 80 years, very poor peasants have waged struggle for land rights and taken on the mind of Pakistan's military to emerge as the most significant working class struggle in Pakistan. Now, the conceptual work then on the intervention that the book then makes is to talk about the insistence on conceptual descriptions of rights and human rights in the Western world. So looking at those concepts, the conceptual languages, the political imaginary, so no unidirectional translation happening here, right? Which is not to say that that is not also linked with some of that rights, or with that kind of rights frameworks, but it also has its own. And the kind of work that I've done is to, as I said, to look at the conceptual description of hak as it appears, to identify the kinds of various justificatory premises of hak. On what basis is hak justified, used, claimed? And the 4 justificatory premises that I found right across some of the movements have been citizenship. So hak used to claim citizenship and so on, but also to claim cosmological rights, rights to ancestral lands, forests, and so on. Also as an Islamic ideal. The interesting thing about hak is that in most of the world where people, anthropologists particularly, have looked at the ways in which hak operates is really within Islamic jurisprudentialism, right? So within Islamic juristic practices that you find haq as a very key concept coming up within, say, Islamic courts and so on, right? In Sharia courts, for example. But actually in South Asia, that's a really interesting thing, is that haq is not linked only to Islamic practices and Islamic ideals, right? Because it's used right across, it cuts across geographic, linguistic, religious caste, maybe gender lines to actually emerge as this key concept that's used to claim a right. But it's also used, as an Islamic ideal, but interestingly, towards secular ends in these movements. So, for example, when the Pakistani, Punjabi peasants in Pakistan are using the word haq and tracing it and citing it within particular paragraphs in the Quran, they're not using it for religious ends, they're sort of using it against the Pakistani state to say, look, if the Quran sort of says that that land belongs to us, we have used it for cultivating for so many years, right? So that end is it's used to a very, very particular end. And this also comes up as a particular ideal of public life. So on. Okay. So here's some of the things, I'm going to wrap up now pretty soon. So some of the things that what haq does, so you might ask me, well, what does haq do to how we think about rights, human rights thinking and human rights politics, right? One of the kinds of key interventions here is that haq is not derivative from humanism, is not derivative, by which I mean they should have been a full stop there. It's not derivative. It's not derivative from the state. And that is a key distinction, because within liberal democratic theorizing, there is an umbilical connection, an umbilical cord between state and citizenship. So if you think about the way when theorizing on citizenship starts, right? If you look at any of these kind of courses, you will see that, that it is a Republican moment, right? In Western political philosophy and thinking that sparks off that relationship between rights and citizenship, right? So the French Declaration, the rights of man, or the American Declaration of Independence and so on. So you've got, and they are seen as the kind of key Republican moments where the citizen comes into being, and that there is a relationship, that direct relationship between the state and the citizen, which comes up as a result of the state being the giver of rights. Yes? And so here, you don't see any of that. You actually see that haq has a justification which is independent of the state. So if you think about the cosmological or the cosmovisions, they're not sort of saying that rights belong to us because they come from the state, they come from us from our ancestors. We have ancestral rights on these lands, right? So it's not the kind of sort of sense that, that the state is the giver of rights in that moment, right? So it's a break. But also, having said that, the reason why the claim making is made to the state is that there is a very clear understanding that the state needs to protect these rights. Yes. So in that sense, it's not simply a kind of a utopian vision. It's actually a kind of a politics or struggle in which it is seen as the duty of the state to protect these rights, which come not from the state but from, say, ancestors. So they have or they come from Islam and so on. And so the other thing is that neither humanism or moral sovereignty of the individuals or their interests, whether collective or individuals, underpin the justification of haq. By which I mean it's not always only an individual right, as you also see. If you think about rights, human rights, and the kinds of ways in which that generationalism and hierarchies of human rights, particularly where civil and political rights are upheld over all others, right? And so on and so forth. That you don't see here. You don't see that the individual is the sole bearer of rights. Actually, you have, for example, rights over ancestral lands and so on are collective rights, right? But interestingly, the state doesn't recognize them as collective rights, and only gives individuals, say, land, documents and so on and so forth. But these are actually owned by the collective. And so it also operates to uphold a cosmological and normative order that includes duties to protect nature. So it's not just humanism, right? It's not that the human or the human being is the center of rights at this moment. It also includes duties, it also includes rights of nature and so on. And then in that moment, it exceeds humanism, right? And therefore, human rights are not only, or rights politics are not only consistent with humanism, but it's also, having said all this, and this is why the focus on conflict and power is so important, is that this is not a horizontal concept, right? If that was the case, it would be very different kind of social structure in these settings that I'm talking about. But this is not a horizontal concept. It's rife with political conflict and struggles and and contestation. And this is not, it's not the case that somebody sort of demands their hug and that you're going to get it, right? So I just want to sort of underscore this point about power and conflict. And when the questions of power and conflict come into being, the moment you start looking at questions of gender and sexuality. And that's when that very neat constructs start to kind of crumble. And in all my tracking of nearly 2 decades in these movements, I have never come across a single instance, in a single movement of mobilizations where rights for women, women's rights, I'm talking about, say, even within the most kind of hackneyed and conservative framing of women's rights, say, in international development circles, right? So, in that kind of framing, I'm not even talking about gender rights and equality, I'm not talking about LGBTQI rights, I'm simply talking about women's rights. Not come across a single struggle in which that question has occurred organically. It's always had to be fed separately. So it tells you something about that question of conflict and power within social movements. But it also brings together thinking about the politics of rights together with the politics of justice. And these two have often stayed apart. We talk about global justice quite differently in the, whereby global justice is often talked in terms of larger kind of things about distribution and so on, whereas rights, theorizing on rights is very much seen in terms of, kind of order priority. Right? So you've got a very different, whereas this kind of forces one to think about politics of rights as the politics of justice, primarily through the focus on structural injustice. So this is the very last slide. So some questions of, let's just say, ethics, justice, and care in thinking about ethically and robustly about social movements as an alternative ground for theory building. Now, this is a huge question. Like I said, this is something that you find philosophers, kind of every time they ask, so where should we look for alternative thinking? Social movements. Escobar talks about social movements. I've been doing this work on social movements, right? So we all have this sort of thing about, okay, but social movements are not panacea. And we have to think about it very, very carefully. And so, and this is clearly not just us, philosophers have talked about it, Rachel Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, and so on. So talked very seriously about that question of, how to think about social movements as a ground for theory building, and how to do this work without falling into the epistemic traps of romanticizing these as power-free zones. And this is something that I've had to kind of really think hard about. But I'm not giving you answers here. I'm simply putting these as to you because I think this is some things that we have to think collectively about. Without turning them into the local, cultural, traditional, or simply those that don't have anything to say to, I don't want to say mainstream thinking, but I think I just ran out of time, so I'll just put it in as mainstream thinking. But in terms of, say, epistemic thinking, right, or epistemologies. How to do that without the will to exceptionalize few examples and for them to serve it up always as confirmation bias. Oh, let's look at these examples and look, this is how, delinking all the ways in which groups who reject the state and operate by themselves and these autonomous collectives work. And you often see the same examples being constantly wheeled out all the time. How to do that work without doing this exceptionalizing. And then how to think carefully with the concepts that are produced by social movements. How to do that conceptual work without falling into the traps of that unidirectional translation, without sort of, you know, and by giving a full account of how you've done that work, right? What kinds of translation practices have occurred? What are the kinds of, you know, intellectual resources that have been used? And how not to do this work that don't make these concepts niche, or the work or the knowledge production as niche and kind of separate and these neat packages, but actually as active participants within knowledge production of social sciences, so that when you have on your curriculum and you're reading a list, you're reading, say, hey, you're also reading a piece on that or by then, and so on, right? That kind of active participation, so that they don't become as these niche things that people will sort of say, oh, if you're interested, maybe here are some readings, you can go away and do it by yourself. Right? But as actually participating, intervening in changing, shifting the epistemic center of knowledge production. And then how to think about global epistemic justice. So this is my first iteration of this thinking, right? I haven't done this stuff before in terms of thinking about global epistemic justice. This is things that I'm thinking about in the last few months. So I thought I'd just put it out there, and so that we can all think about it collectively, because the stakes are too high and we need to think about this collectively. Thank you very much.
Thank you.